Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this next Treasuret webinar about data security strategies in the finance industry. Before we dive into introductions, just a couple of housekeeping rules. Yes, this is being recorded, and we will send the recording out along with all the questions and answers. Dr. Lisa and I will do our best to answer all the questions today, but if we don't get to all of them, we will send the answers along in the email with the recording. There is a chat where you can ask your questions. There's also the Q&A, so feel free to use those. And with that, let's go ahead and dive into the introductions. So my name is Aaron Stillman. I'm the head of product marketing at Treasuret. I just celebrated my 1-year anniversary at Treasuret, so I'm lucky enough to be spending yet a second time with Dr. Lisa McGee, and I'll go ahead and let her introduce herself.
Thanks, Aaron, and thank you for the opportunity to do this again with you. My name is Dr. Lisa McKee. I'm a founding partner at American Security and Privacy here in the U.S., and we help financial services and other organizations with their security and privacy needs. So thank you, Aaron.
No, thank you. So I've got a couple of stats over here that I'm going to use to sort of set the stage. There was an IBM report from the threat intelligence that indicated the financial sector is the second most targeted worldwide. And actually over here in Europe, once again, it's the 37%. I think it's the highest percentage across all of Europe within the finance industry. And then the last stat that I'll share is according to Positive Technologies, the 2023 Cyber Threat Report, 68% of leaks contain clients' personal data. So just to sort of set the stage for us, Dr. McKee, what is it about the financial industry? Is it because we're talking about money? Like, is that the thing that makes this so attractive to all those bad doers?
Definitely, that is one of the targets. It's always monetary gain. Usually, there's two drivers that we see when it comes to bad actors and adversaries. And what are they after? One, it's usually financial driven, and then secondarily, it's harm and to prove a point. Right? I'm doing it because I can, because you think you're secure and you're really not. So I'm going to prove to you that you're not.
Yep, that makes sense. I mean, sometimes the logical answer is the right answer. So give us a general assessment of the current state of cybersecurity in the financial industry. Where are we today in 2024?
Yeah, I'd like to say we're better than where we were 20 years ago or so when I started my career in technology. And in some cases we are. Organizations in a lot of ways are trying to do better. We have more laws, we have more regs for governance around cybersecurity and financial services. We have a lot of oversight here in the United States. I know you do as well in Europe and the UK. Unfortunately, though, Aaron, you talk about these stats, and what we see is while there's an increase in regulation, there is not a decrease then in the fines and the breaches and the data that's being compromised. Where I've done research in this, and I would have thought more regs would mean less breaches, and it's not the case, right? We're seeing both of them increase exponentially. So then the question is, well, why? Right? If you're more regulated now than you were 20 years ago, we have all these state laws and all these international laws. Why does it keep happening? And I don't know the why so much as to why businesses make the decisions that they do. But what we know is that a lot of it comes down to business decisions where they're more after, how can I protect the data? How can I protect the business with the least amount of financial impact, because I want to make money and I want to protect my board and my shareholders and the profit.
Yep. It's funny, regardless of whether we're talking about cybersecurity or many other things, it always sort of comes down to people, process, technology, as well as the balance between wanting to do well financially, but investing appropriately to be secure and private. And that's what we hear day in and day out at Treasury when we're talking to our customers, being able to find that balance. So let's talk about some of the key trends and technologies regarding cybersecurity efforts in the financial industry. What are you seeing over the past few years?
A big push for better cyber hygiene is what we call it. So making sure that the controls are in place, that there's security end to end, privacy end to end across systems, applications, data. Multi-factor authentication being another one, restricting access to who has data. And I like to refer to the term point in time access. Aaron, you and I both know our jobs don't warrant the same level of access to systems and applications 24/7. I don't know about you, but I'm not working 24/7. I work a lot of crazy hours. I know you do too, but we all sleep at some point. And so the adversaries know that, and then they're coming in usually off cycle where a lot of those things happen and where they're gaining access to systems because it's less likely they're going to be detected. So if businesses adopt a more point in time or zero trust privacy, zero trust security implementation, then the likelihood of those accounts being compromised is diminished because those accounts and that admin access isn't turned on all the time. So multi-factor authentication and appropriate access controls, as well as encryption, right? You and I spent a lot of time in our last webinar talking about encryption, and though if the data is encrypted, even if it's compromised, the likelihood that it can be decrypted is still less than if it's not encrypted at all.
Yep, that's spot on. I definitely learned a lot in our last webinar. And, we see this in the day-to-day at Treasurit. We drink our own champagne or eat our own dog food. So we use Treasurit ourselves. And there are settings that allow us to revoke access, and you're only allowed to open something X number of times. So that's sort of built-in functionality. And every once in a while, it does cause a little friction, right? I'll click on a link and I can't access it. And then I have to go and ask for permission. But to your point, it's better to have that friction than to have access 24/7, because I certainly don't need it 24/7. So, all right, if we move in, we started talking about regulations. What are some of the biggest challenges that the financial industry is facing? And can you break those challenges down for, let's say, like a small and medium-sized company versus a large company? How is it different?
Yeah, and that's a great point because they're not necessarily equal. Even though the laws and regs and obligations of a small to medium-sized company typically are the same as a large organization, it doesn't mean that they know how to implement that or tackle and manage that. So when we talk about laws and regs and standards, they are generally the same. So unless there's reasons that something wouldn't apply because there's an exemption of some sort, we know that there's lots of different exemptions. If you comply with this, then you don't have to do that type of thing. But what it comes down to is large organizations, financial services, billion-dollar banks, right? I work with several billion-dollar banks that are pretty large organizations. Oftentimes they have their own internal security teams, their own internal technology resources that are managing a lot of this for them internally. And then they're outsourcing less, relying less on third parties, and they have it internally. They also typically have larger budgets. Financial, it all comes down to dollars and cents, right? How much can I spend to secure my environment? And the resources is a big piece of that, right? Because I'm spending money on people or outsourcing that. So that's one thing that we see in larger organizations, that they have more resources, they have larger budgets, they can afford more things, better things than maybe a small or medium-sized organization. And typically what we see with those small and medium-sized banks is because they don't have the larger checkbook per se to fund their needs, they're outsourcing more. Because I can't afford to have an internal employee at 200,000, but I can afford to spend half of that for like a managed service provider and outsource some of these, technology and security requirements. And so that's one of the big things. But the problem with that then becomes, I've outsourced that. And then they typically are like, okay, I'm done. Like, I don't have to do anything more, without realizing you're still on the hook for that. And did you thoroughly vet that third party that you're outsourcing that to. Because Aaron, you shared a whole bunch of stats at the beginning, which are fascinating. And the one that I have been most interested in recently is the increase in third party breaches is exponentially growing, almost at a bigger rate than where we're seeing breaches happen in other places.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. For a long time, the big stat was around sort of the human error. And we're now seeing, these third-party breaches having a much more of an impact. What I also find interesting about sort of the small and large company differences that you pointed out is we see sort of two types of profiles come to Treasury and become customers. One are those who are looking to invest as they're starting up and they're growing their business, and they want to do it safely and securely and privately and sort of build the trust into the community as their brand is growing. And the other, unfortunately, are the ones who got burned. And so they didn't do it up front, and then they sort of learned the hard way, and they had to come off the back of that. And unfortunately, sometimes it's a little too late. The damage is done, and it takes a lot to sort of gain the trust back. I think consumers, there is still brand loyalty, but it's fickle. I mean, there's so many options out there that, you can switch brands, with a snap of a finger. So one of the advices I give after, being at Treasured for a year and seeing everything and talking to people like yourself is, better safe than sorry. Don't risk your brand and don't risk everything trying to save a couple of bucks here or there. But let's keep going on the train of thought around regulation. So in the US, we've got the cybersecurity framework 2. It's being finalized this year. There's a lot of momentum around NIST 2, and specifically in the finance industry with DORA. That's in Europe, and it's making a really big impact. So what is your sense of these concepts? Are they going to make us all safer, or is it a misconception? You talked earlier about the increase in regulations is not necessarily having the impact we would expect. So what needs to change in some of these regulations? Can anything really be done, or is it just the technology that just keeps advancing, and are we in a vicious cycle? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, technology is always going to be a struggle, right? If you're in tech, it's every day there's something new that you're learning or hearing about or whatever, and so it either gets you excited or it doesn't. And the technology piece, I think, is always going to be there. One thing I like to stress and emphasize is the difference between chasing compliance versus being secure, right? I can be compliant but not be secure and not have privacy. But most likely, if I'm secure and have privacy and security controls implemented, then I'm likely going to also then be compliant. And I think that really is the mindset of where companies are doing well, as you were talking about, or where maybe they got bitten in the past and now their mindset has changed to where they're coming back around and saying chasing compliance is not going to get you there. So as a person that does a lot of compliance and audit, especially in financial services, if you're just chasing those laws and regs, doing the bare minimum that those laws and regs state that you have to do, then generally speaking, in a lot of places, you're probably not secure and meet your privacy obligations end to end across the entire organization, because you're just picking and choosing, oh, I did this and now I went over and did that, without looking at everything more holistically. So when we talk about NIST 2 that's coming out, the CSF framework, and DORA and NIS and these others, what I like to recommend to individuals and to even cyber and technology folks, because you're your inside voice within your organization to help drive change, is to implement a comprehensive security and privacy framework and methodology. So NIST has the CSF, they have the privacy framework that's also going through some revisions this year. And then we have ISO that has security and privacy complementary frameworks. So organizations that are thinking about those more comprehensively, collaboratively with security and privacy, I think it's going to get them a lot further.
Yeah, I want to sort of stick on this point because when we were talking recently in preparation for this, you brought up a really, really, I think poignant angle when looking at all of these regulations. I know, just studying, for example, DORA, there are so many regulations and articles, and it's so completely overwhelming. And that's just one amongst many. And so when you talk about the framework, I really like the way you positioned it. And maybe you could just take another 30 seconds, talk a little bit more, because what I conceptualized was not necessarily focusing on just being compliant with one regulation, but doing something where you're capturing like 80%, right? Um, Maybe
Yes.
dig in a little bit more about this framework concept.
Yeah. So one of the things I like to talk about is what I call a compliance footprint. So does your organization have a list of all the laws, regs, standards, etc., that apply to them? And so by knowing those, then I can start looking at, well, what are the controls within each of those? They're all generally going to have access controls, whether that's multi-factor authentication or strong passwords or restricting access to a data center. Access is access is access, and it's going to be in all of them. Like that's just a standard that they all have. Policies and procedures and governance and some of these things are encryption, right? We talk a ton about encryption. That's another one of those defaults that you're going to see in all of those laws, regs, and standards. So instead of chasing, did I do this one law? Did I do that one law? If I take a step back, document everything, map that to controls within the organization, and then have a solid control framework that's based around industry best practice with comprehensive security and privacy, I'm not chasing laws then, because that's how I get to that 80 or 90%. Now, there are going to be some of those nuances that you talked about, right? That's going to get you 80 or 90% there. There are certain things, especially on the privacy side, where maybe the time to respond to a data subject request is going to vary. In the US, it's generally 45 days. In the EU, it's 30 days. In Brazil and some other countries, it's different. It's 15 days. So you are going to have those nuances and those outliers, but they're going to be far and few and more sparing than that 80 or 90%.
Yeah, I really think that's spot on. I love that approach because, to your point earlier, not that many companies have the $1 billion checkbook to hire all these in-house resources. So taking this framework approach really resonates for me. Working at Treasury, we're one of the first ones to the market with end-to-end encryption. It's been in our DNA from day one, and that's how we differentiate in the market. And so it's a little validating seeing all these regulations coming up, talking about encryption and really pushing that forward. Instead of hearing it from me, for the audience to hear from you, talk a little bit about the difference between, encryption, SSL, and certificates and things of that nature versus real end-to-end encryption. And like, what is the difference and why are we seeing this push in this direction finally?
Yeah, what a lot of it is when those terms that you just mentioned, right? Like SSL and you've got SSH and you've got all these other terms that we hear all the time, and TLS and what's deprecated and what's not, and what can I do? It's different layers of encryption. So am I encrypting data at rest? So wherever it's stored. Am I encrypting data that's in use? So, hey, you're looking at something on your file share on your workstation. Is your workstation encrypted? Maybe the location of where I'm looking at that data at is encrypted. And then you've got data that's in motion. So when I look at it on a website, is that connection encrypted? When I'm transmitting data from one point to another, is that data encrypted? Both within at my point. So Aaron, if you and I are sharing data, right, and I'm sending it from my workstation and I'm sending it to your workstation, we talk about end-to-end encryption. It's encrypted at my workstation. encrypted all the way from me to you, and then encrypted still when it gets to your workstation to that endpoint. So that's that end-to-end model that we talk about, that at every point along the way, there is some form of encryption and protection that's happening around that data. So even if they intercept it at my workstation along the path to get to you or on your end, it's still protected through that whole process of transmission and access of data.
And that's really spot on. It's another topic we talk a lot about, and one of the takeaways I think for the audience, or when I'm talking to prospects or different customers, encryption is not encryption, right? You see it on a lot of websites and a lot of companies talk about it, but there is a big difference between something that's encrypted and something that's end-to-end encrypted, because you are exchanging data, you're sending files. It's not enough just to store it in one place. The collaboration that's occurring between people you work with and people you don't work with, your partners, your customers, you really want to make sure that when it's in transit, it's still encrypted, so it can't be breached, or you can't be taken advantage of. So
Aaron, one of the things you all have there at Treasuret that I thought was a great resource for this when we talk about encryption is your data rooms. Do you want
yep.
to spend a moment and talk about what is a data room? Because that was something I learned in conversations with you all at Treasuret about what those are and how your customers are utilizing that. So when we talk about that end to end, now it's on my workstation and I'm viewing that in a secure way.
Yep. Yeah, I love it. Now you're asking me questions. Okay. So we do a lot of work with the financial industry as well as other industries. And what it usually boils down to are organizations who want to be able, as we were speaking earlier, to grow their business, make a profit, but at the end of the day, do it safely and securely. So within the Treasury workspace, these virtual data rooms, they're not just for merger and acquisitions, although that's usually what you see when you're surfing the web and you search a virtual data room. It's now becoming much broader into your day-to-day collaboration with your colleagues, as well as with your clients and with your partners. If you simply think about, a sales deal room, that can be a data room, right? Where you're engaging a prospect, you're sending them a contract, an NDA, a presentation. All of these things you want to make sure are captured within a space, a site that's completely encrypted. So it really fosters the collaboration, the ability to exchange files, share files, receive files, edit documents, whether you're uploading them into a data room, whatever the case may be. It's the opportunity to really collaborate, grow your business, but doing it securely and safely within an end-to-end encrypted data room. So that's what we mean at Treasuret when we talk about it. It's no longer just the storage of a document, but really the facilitation of a collaboration amongst your colleagues, your clients, and your partners. Thanks for bringing that up, Dr. McKee. I think one of the last questions we have here is, what are some of the challenges? What do you see are some of the biggest challenges for the financial industry, whether it's related to these regulations or anything else that's coming over the next, 1, 3, 5 years?
The one thing that we've continued to talk about for many years that I see to be a challenge in the years to come, unforeseeably in the future, is resources. Right? We've been hearing for years the lack of resources, skilled resources that we had in technology. And then security became a big thing. So tech people were moving into security. So now we have a deficit in both. Well, then privacy is becoming a hot topic, has been for a while, and is just gaining more momentum. And now we see resources shifting from technology and security into privacy. So we're taking that same pool of specialists, right? And now thinning that out even more. So I think that's still going to be a big challenge. even though we have more people entering the workforce, even though we have a lot of new programs and education and certificates that are out there, we still don't have enough people to fill the roles that are open. So I think that that's going to continue to be a problem until, for the unforeseeable future, unfortunately. I think the other problem is going to be because we don't have the adequate skill set and workforce, it's going to be then financial. And how do we get in front of the adversaries, right? The bad guys only have to get it right once, but you have to be right 24/7, 365. Like, there's no forgiveness. And so it keeps a lot of people up at night. It's exhausting. It's tiring. So how do we then, stay in front of that as defense, right? Cyber defense. I'm not sure what the answer is to that, because we don't all have the same resources. We don't have all the same knowledge. I'm not a hacker, right? I don't do forensics. That's not my thing. So how they're going to look at something, and somebody that's sitting in front of the keyboard all day, is going to be different than what I'm going to look at from a compliance and audit perspective. So, and then I think too, Aaron, the other piece is we are still going to continue to see an increase in laws and regs and standards, because people keep thinking that's the solve. Well, we have more breaches. Let's throw more laws at it because this one little thing was the problem. So we'll solve it with another Band-Aid of a law. I personally think, and I did some of this in my research and my dissertation, is that I feel organizations are over-regulated to the point that it is crippling them, and they're not able to meet all of those laws and regs. If you've got laws and regs, and especially I see that here in the US, I've seen it internationally as well, where I have to comply with this and this. But this one says I need to do that. A great example is password requirements. Do I change them 90 days? Do I change them every 180 days? Do they have to be 14 characters? Is 8 efficient? Like, how do I manage that when every law, reg, and standard is slightly different? And how do I make sure that I'm compliant across the board when they're all a little bit different, and in some cases conflicting with each other? So what I would like to see is, I think we actually need to take a step back and say, what are all the things that are out there for laws, regs, and standards? And maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it made sense that those were based on data types or industry, right? We have financial services that we're talking about today, but there's healthcare laws, there's education laws, there's laws for children. We have all these different ones that are out there. Do we really need them? Because now with the privacy stuff that's really starting to change everything, personal data is personal data. Does it really matter what the classification is of that data? So if we take a step back, lighten things up, have one set of comprehensive privacy security laws instead of the hundreds that companies have to manage today, I actually think that that's the better solution.
We're moving into the sort of Q&A, and I think we just got a question in from Neil, which aligns very closely with what you were just saying, Dr. McKee. How about a single federal law? Is there something similar to, Neil just typed in, health and safety? Is there something we could imagine on the other side that would make sense, that you would support?
So we have HIPAA here in the US. You have a similar law in the EU for that health and safety aspect of it. But that's going to look at things differently than what financial services is doing. And the SEC, and you have NIST and DORA and things like that over in the EU. But does it matter? Right? If I'm Dr. Lisa McKee at a bank, and I'm Dr. Lisa McKee at my doctor's office, I'm still the same individual. So does it matter if I'm looking at it from a financial services perspective versus a health and safety perspective? One of the things you had mentioned earlier that made me think about it is those organizations that have gotten burned and now are making different decisions versus those that have that customer mentality, like from the gate, go forward. And with the comment of the health and safety, I really think that's what drives customer trust. That's what drives customer brand and loyalty. You kept talking about brand. if you're doing the right things up front and you tell people that you're doing that and that that's what's important to you as an organization, the rest of it's going to follow, right? People will come and they will stay.
I agree. I mean, we see it at Treasury as well. A lot of companies, it's all about they put a lot behind their customer support. And we have great customer service and customer support at Treasury. But because of our end-to-end encryption, for example, if you lose your password, we can't help you because we don't even have access to it. So it's one of those funny things I like to joke about where sometimes bad customer support is actually good customer support because yeah, it falls into that category. But I'm going into the Q&A. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. I think we can give it another minute and maybe go back to sort of the three takeaways from this conversation. If there were three, Dr. McKee, yeah, talk us through them.
Yeah, so cyber hygiene, that comprehensive security privacy set of controls that then map to that 80-90% of your obligations from a regulatory perspective. I think that's always going to be how companies are successful in leading with cyber hygiene. The next thing, and that's more comprehensive, the next thing being at a minimum, do you have end-to-end encryption in place and then strong access controls on top of that? Because even though it's easy to say cyber hygiene, full set of controls, you and I both know that's easier said than done. Teams don't always have the resources. It may not be appropriate if you're a small and medium-sized businesses. Maybe you don't have to do all that stuff. But at a minimum, you should absolutely have your data encrypted and you should have restricted access and multi-factor authentication. Because the likelihood that somebody's going to get your username and password, especially what we've been seeing in the news right now with all the breaches and the billions. I read an article yesterday about 10 billion records being exposed by attackers. You can't stay in front of changing your password. But if I have multi-factor authentication, what's the likelihood that you get my password and my username and my email address and access to my cell phone or access to the authentication app if you use the authenticator app on your phone? So those are the two go-tos that at a minimum companies should be doing.
And it's really incredible to be talking about multi-factor authentication after so many years. It's been around for decades, and yet it's still such an effective, underutilized method. All right, we got another question, so good, keep them coming. How would you rate the security spend efficiency? I consult for large multinational companies, and they are wasting maybe half of their budget on old technology just to show compliance to management. But in reality, this spend provides little to no data protection.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that gets back to what I talked about with chasing compliance versus actually being secure. So this is a great question for that. And I see this every day. One of the comments that I would say with this is, while organizations are still spending a lot on old technologies, it's not that those old technologies are wrong or bad or broken. I heard recently someone was talking about, well, we still got a lot of companies that are using mainframes and old school stuff. That's what I went to college for. That's what I learned as a computer programmer was mainframe technologies, because that's what we had 25 years ago. We didn't have all this shiny web stuff that we have now. And what I think is important to keep in mind is what fundamentally makes sense for that business, the way that that company does business and the technologies that are already in place. And Aaron, the whole focus of this largely is financial services. They've been around for hundreds of years. It's not new. What people don't always tend to realize is those technologies that set up those banks are those old school technologies, mainframes and other things that's not so easy to change. Think about all of the ATMs. I worked at banks. I work with banks all the time. And you want to change something, now they have to go out to all the branches, all the ATMs, all these other things to make one little change that you and I are more mindful of being in this space, but everyday consumers are not. And they're like, well, why can't you just change something? Because you don't know and really understand the impact of what that change means. So while they are chasing compliance and some of those older technologies, in a way, those are tried and true and proven, and in some cases more secure than these web things and these newer shiny things that companies are going after. Because they're new, we don't know how to secure them. We don't know how to use them. We don't know how the adversaries are then using them against us. So not always is new mean better.
Yeah, and I think it's also, as you stated, the working in software, we talk a lot about tech debt, right? Or legacy debt. And I think you brought up a really good point that these financial institutions have been around so long and implemented so many of these older technologies that the legacy debt associated with that is got to be massive to try and overhaul. I'm taking a look. I think we're pretty much at time and we've gotten through all the questions. So just wanted to say thank you so much, Dr. McGee, for doing this yet again with us. It's always a pleasure. We have our next webinar coming up around NIS2, which will be very much related or a continued theme to what we talked about today. So thank you everyone out there for joining, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day or evening or morning, depending on where you're calling from.
Thank you, Aaron.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.